The Australian forces' guerrilla warfare the Viet Cong couldn't outsmart. The jungle was thick with heat and the sound of insects. But it was the silence of the soldiers that spoke the loudest. The air felt heavy, pressing down with the weight of an unseen enemy. Imagine being there. Your heartbeat the loudest sound in the world. Your mind focused on every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch. In the thick of the Vietnam War, Australian soldiers learned that guerrilla warfare wasn't just about tactics. It was about survival, nerve, and the will to push forward against an enemy that thrived in the shadows. Their enemies were invisible, yet ever present. Every corner could hold a trap. Every patch of ground was a potential threat. Yet the Australians adapted, pushing through the challenges with unmatched resilience and innovation. This is the story of their struggle in the dense jungles of Vietnam, where cunning tactics and unbreakable resolve became their weapons. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Chapter 1. Silent Stealth. The ambushes in the jungle. The jungle felt alive. The dense canopy blocked out most of the sun, casting everything in shadow, but the heat was still oppressive. It was the kind of heat that soaked through uniforms and made every step feel like a small victory. But it wasn't the heat that kept the soldiers on edge. It was the silence. Imagine being part of a small patrol, moving through the dense underbrush, barely making a sound. The only noise is the soft rustle of leaves underfoot, and the occasional bird call, which, for a moment, might feel reassuring. But every soldier knew that a single misstep, a misplaced footfall, could be the difference between life and death. The Australians were well aware of their surroundings. They had learned quickly in Vietnam that stealth was their greatest weapon. No one spoke unless necessary. Every movement was calculated, measured. Their patrols were small, no more than 6 men at a time. Spread out in a line, they maintained a careful distance, not so far apart that they couldn't communicate with a whisper or a hand gesture, but far enough to minimize the risk of a single blast taking them all out. Their enemy, the Viet Cong, was a ghost in the jungle. Never seen, always heard. They didn't engage in conventional battles. They ambushed, they struck hard, and they disappeared just as quickly. The Australians, too, had learned to fight like shadows, using the terrain to their advantage, blending in with the environment. The key to surviving in the jungle wasn't just silence. It was patience. For hours, they moved without speaking, eyes constantly scanning the thick foliage for any sign of movement. A flicker of light, a rustling leaf, a snap of a twig could mean danger. Even the smallest movement could be the enemy trying to gain a tactical advantage. They had learned to trust their instincts, their training, and most of all, each other. The soldiers moved with precision. Their spacing was tight but deliberate. It wasn't just about avoiding detection. It was about being prepared to react instantly if something went wrong. If one man fell, the rest would know exactly what to do. Each soldier had his role. The lead scout, the rear guard, the point man. Their survival depended on every soldier's ability to execute his part flawlessly. It was a delicate balance, but in the jungle, even the smallest imbalance could prove fatal. Every so often, the point man would stop, raising his hand to signal the rest of the patrol to hold. The lead would take a step forward, crouch down, and examine the ground. Tracks, fresh ones. They were in enemy territory, and the Viet Cong were close. The tension was palpable. No one spoke. The soldiers stared at the tracks, considering their next move. They had learned to fight the enemy without ever seeing them. The point man, kneeling, would assess the situation, noting the direction of the footprints. The rest of the squad would fan out, each man taking up a position, ready for whatever came next. The jungle was a labyrinth, paths twisted and turned in every direction, and every corner could hide a threat. The soldiers learned to read the signs, the way the branches were disturbed, the slight discoloration of the soil, the subtle clues that, if ignored, could lead to a deadly ambush. It wasn't just about spotting the enemy. It was about anticipating their moves before they made them. The Australian forces didn't just train in combat. They trained for the environment. They knew that the jungle could turn a soldier's mind as quickly as it could turn his body. The heat was suffocating, and the humidity made it hard to breathe. But it was the constant alertness, the never-ending vigilance that wore them down. After days of moving through the jungle, sleep-deprived and hungry, the soldiers' senses were sharpened to a razor's edge. But it was also exhausting. Fear, too, had a way of creeping into the mind. It was a quiet fear, one that lingered in the back of your mind, a thought that told you the enemy could strike at any moment. Then came the moment that every soldier dreaded, the ambush. It started with the faintest sound, barely audible over the wind. But it was enough to send every soldier into a state of high alert. A twig snapped, followed by the rush of movement through the leaves. The Viet Cong were close. They had been tracking the Australians, and now they were ready to strike. The soldiers had trained for this. They knew what to do. Within seconds, the patrol split, each soldier dropping into a crouch, using the terrain to hide their positions. The enemy had no idea they were being watched. The Australians had become shadows in the jungle, blending in with the undergrowth. The ambush was swift. The Viet Cong charged forward, guns raised, expecting to catch the Australians off guard. But the Australians were ready. The soldiers didn't fire immediately. They waited, watching, calculating. They knew that one wrong move could expose them. They held their fire until the last possible moment, each shot taken with precision, aiming for the enemy's weak spots. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun. The Viet Cong had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and outgunned. The Australians had used the jungle to their advantage, turning the tables on the enemy in a way that left the Viet Cong disoriented and retreating into the thick underbrush. But even in victory, the soldiers didn't relax. The jungle was still dangerous. The threat remained. It was only a matter of time before the next ambush, the next challenge. But for now, the Australians had survived. They had outwitted their enemies once again, and in this war of attrition, every day they survived was a victory in itself. The men regrouped, moving silently through the jungle once more, their senses heightened, their focus unwavering. In the jungle, it wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about surviving long enough to fight the next one. Chapter 2. Building Trust in the Fog of War. Jungle was never truly silent. Even during the long hours between engagements, the soldiers could hear the distant hum of the landscape, the buzz of insects, the whisper of the wind through the trees. But it was the silence of the patrol that held the most weight. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound. It was the quiet tension between men who knew that their survival depended not just on their skills, but on their trust in each other. Patrolling through the jungle was a delicate operation. The men were scattered, their movements slow and deliberate, each soldier taking care not to disturb the environment or break the disciplined silence. Yet amidst the constant noise of nature, it was the quiet camaraderie between the soldiers that provided the only real comfort. Imagine being in the middle of it all. You're part of a small patrol, each soldier moving like a shadow. Your senses are on high alert, constantly searching for signs of danger. You trust your training, but more importantly, you trust the men beside you. Every move you make is a silent agreement with your comrades to survive this together. The jungle doesn't care about you. It doesn't care if you're scared or tired or hungry. The only thing that matters is how well you work as a team. The soldiers moved in pairs, carefully spaced out, knowing the success of the patrol depended on their coordination. One wrong move could alert the enemy, and then everything would change. But even in the most tense moments, the soldiers had learned to trust each other implicitly. Every man knew that his mate was watching his back, and the trust allowed them to focus on the mission, staying alive. In the thick of the jungle, there was no room for hesitation. A soldier's ability to remain calm under fire could make the difference between life and death. Yet there was no single soldier who didn't feel the weight of the situation. Fear was an ever-present companion. It didn't manifest in screams or panic, but in the subtle tension of the muscles, the deep breath taken before every movement, and the sharpness of every glance. It was a quiet, constant reminder that death was only a misstep away. One soldier, Private Jenkins, had learned this lesson the hard way during a previous patrol. The Viet Cong had ambushed them in the dead of night, and Jenkins had been frozen in place, his body paralyzed by fear. It was Corporal Mitchell, the seasoned veteran, who had saved him. Mitchell had pulled Jenkins out of the line of fire and dragged him to safety. It was in that moment that Jenkins understood the true meaning of trust. It wasn't just about being capable of pulling the trigger or navigating the jungle. It was about knowing that your brothers would be there when you faltered. But trust wasn't something that happened overnight. It was built over time, through shared experiences and mutual support. Every patrol, every ambush, every night spent in the jungle taught them something new about each other. It was a bond forged under extreme pressure, where every man had to put his faith in his comrades. When they lay in the dirt, waiting for the enemy to pass, it was the quiet nod or a brief hand gesture that reassured them. They were not alone. As they moved deeper into enemy territory, each soldier's mind was focused on the task at hand, but there was also a quiet understanding between them. It wasn't about heroism, it was about survival. Each man had his part to play. The pointman led the way, constantly scanning for signs of danger, while the others followed in tight formation. Everyone had a job, a responsibility, and they relied on each other to get through the mission safely. There were times when the men would stop and exchange a glance, the tension so thick that even a brief eye contact was enough to communicate everything. "We're in this together," it said. "Don't let me down." The psychological toll of this environment was immense. The constant threat of ambushes, the ever-present noise of the jungle, and the oppressive heat all added up to a kind of mental fatigue that was hard to explain. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that wore them down. It was the strain of being constantly on edge, never truly able to relax. It was a strange thing, this fear. It wasn't a fear that paralyzed you. It was a fear that fueled your actions. Every sound, every shadow, every rustle of the leaves could be the enemy. But the soldiers had learned to embrace this fear, to use it as a tool. They were never truly at ease, but they had learned to function in that state of heightened awareness. It was as if the fear itself had become a part of them. Yet, amid the fear and uncertainty, there were moments of clarity, moments where the bond between the soldiers shone through. It wasn't in grand gestures or speeches, but in the little things, the quiet word of encouragement, the shared laugh in the middle of a tense situation, the silent acknowledgement that they would do anything for one another. These were the moments that kept them going. As the patrol moved deeper into the jungle, they knew the enemy was near. The terrain had changed. The air was thick with humidity and their senses were heightened. They moved slowly, carefully, every soldier keenly aware of his surroundings, but no one spoke. There was no need for words. The trust between them was enough. In the heart of the jungle, trust wasn't just a luxury. It was a necessity. Every soldier knew that if one of them faltered, the others would be there to pick him up. There was no room for second-guessing, no room for hesitation. The survival of the unit depended on their ability to move as one. And so they continued, quiet, determined, united. The enemy was out there, but as long as they had each other, they had a fighting chance. Chapter 3. Tactical Innovation, Traps and Countermeasures. The jungle was a battlefield like no other. It was alive, constantly shifting, unpredictable and unforgiving. And the enemy? They were ghosts, weaving in and out of the dense undergrowth, disappearing into the shadows before the Australians could even see them. To win in such a place, one had to adapt. The Australians learned quickly that traditional tactics wouldn't suffice in this type of warfare. Here, innovation, creativity, and the ability to think on their feet were just as important as firepower and strategy. The Viet Cong thrived in the jungle, using the dense foliage to hide and ambush Australian patrols. The Australians had to learn to turn the jungle into their advantage, outsmarting their enemies by using the environment itself as a weapon. It was in the art of setting traps and countermeasures where they truly found their edge. One of the most effective tactics employed by the Australian forces was the use of booby traps. These weren't complex devices. Often they were simple yet deadly, relying on local materials and the environment itself to catch the enemy off guard. They could be as simple as a hidden pit covered with leaves and branches, a sharp bamboo spike hidden beneath the surface. Or they could be more intricate, like tripwires attached to grenades or mines, set to explode the moment the enemy walked by. The point of these traps wasn't just to inflict casualties, but to create fear and uncertainty in the enemy's ranks. Every step they took in the jungle could be their last. The soldiers set the traps with precision, making sure they blended perfectly into the environment, nearly invisible to anyone not paying attention. They used the same stealth that they employed on patrols to camouflage their deadly creations. But while the Australians were setting traps, the Viet Cong were doing the same. The jungle was a battlefield of traps and counter-traps, each side trying to outwit the other. The Australians knew that the Viet Cong, having the same familiarity with the terrain, would likely anticipate their traps, and so they had to be more clever, more unpredictable. The booby traps became more creative, evolving in complexity as both sides honed their skills. One of the most memorable moments of tactical ingenuity came during a mission where the Australians had to clear an area suspected of being heavily booby-trapped. They knew they couldn't just march through it. They had to think their way through. Corporal Smith, a veteran of several jungle operations, took the lead. He had learned to read the jungle in a way few others could. He was able to spot the signs that something had been disturbed. A broken twig, a slight change in the pattern of the foliage. He knew when something was wrong, and his team trusted his judgment. Smith was methodical. He ordered the patrol to move slowly, carefully, checking the ground with every step. But it wasn't just the ground he was checking. He was looking for the faintest sign of disruption in the environment. The enemy would hide their traps well, but they couldn't hide every detail. A slight shift in the earth or an unnatural break in the pattern of the jungle was enough for Smith to spot danger. As the patrol advanced, they came across a trap, a crude but deadly pit hidden under the ground. It had been carefully disguised, but Smith's sharp eye had caught it. He signaled to the others, and they quickly moved to disarm it. The trap was deactivated, and the patrol moved on. But it wasn't just the physical danger of the traps that made the mission so challenging. It was the mental toll. The constant stress of knowing that at any moment something could trigger an explosion kept every soldier on edge. But even as they disarmed traps, the Viet Cong had their own tricks. Sometimes they would deliberately leave a trap half disarmed, setting it up so it would be triggered when the Australians thought they were safe. It was a game of wits, one that required not just strength and skill, but patience and foresight. The Australian forces had their own countermeasures. They had learned to read the signs of the jungle and the patterns of the Viet Cong. They knew when something was out of place, when a certain area was too quiet or too disturbed. Over time, the soldiers developed a keen sense of intuition, an ability to feel when something was wrong, even when they couldn't see it. They could tell when they were being followed, when the ground beneath their feet wasn't quite right. This intuition was as valuable as any weapon, as it kept them alive in situations where sheer firepower wouldn't have been enough. The countermeasures also extended to how the Australians handled the aftermath of an ambush. After each skirmish, the soldiers would take meticulous care to check their equipment, resecure their positions, and reaffirm their strategy. They'd never let their guard down, never assume that they had the upper hand. Every mission required constant vigilance, because in the jungle, the fight was never really over. The soldiers also began to use deception to their advantage. They'd plant false trails, mislead the enemy into thinking they were retreating when they were actually setting up a trap of their own. The Viet Cong, for their part, were quick to pick up on this tactic, but the Australians stayed one step ahead. It was a back-and-forth battle of wits, each side trying to outsmart the other. In addition to the traps, the Australians also used their knowledge of the terrain to gain an edge. The thick jungle wasn't just an obstacle, it was a tool. They would move quietly through the underbrush, using the trees and foliage for cover. When they were engaged in combat, they used the landscape to create choke points, narrow paths or dense thickets that funneled the enemy into kill zones. The Viet Cong, accustomed to using the jungle for cover, would sometimes find themselves caught in the very environment that had once given them the advantage. Yet for all their innovation and tactics, The jungle remained a constant, unpredictable adversary. Even when the soldiers set traps and countermeasures, they knew that they could never fully control the environment. It was a battlefield where the line between strategy and survival blurred, and every victory, no matter how small, was earned through cunning, patience, and a deep understanding of the jungle. By the time the patrol moved back to base after their mission, every soldier was exhausted. But there was a quiet pride in their steps. They had survived another day, outsmarted the enemy once again, and proven that in the jungle, survival wasn't just about force. It was about intelligence, creativity, and the willingness to adapt. Chapter 4, Psychological Warfare. The Enemy's Mind Games. In the thick jungle of Vietnam, it wasn't just the bullets that could kill you. It was the constant, gnawing fear of the unknown. For the Australian soldiers, the enemy was as much in their minds as it was in the dense underbrush. The constant threat of ambush, the unseen presence of the Viet Cong played on the soldiers' psyches. Fear, like the jungle itself, was ever present. It crept into their thoughts, made their hands shake, their hearts race. The psychological toll of guerrilla warfare was immense, and it wasn't something that could be easily quantified with a body count or a captured enemy. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be seen on the surface. The Viet Cong were masters of psychological warfare. They didn't need to fight with brute force. Often, they didn't even need to engage directly. Their strategy was built on constant, subtle pressure, ambushes that left you feeling paranoid and vulnerable, traps that made you second-guess every step you took, constantly hearing the enemy but never seeing them, the fear of what might be lurking just beyond the trees in the dark corners of the jungle could break even the most experienced soldiers. Imagine the fear of being out on patrol, your heart pounding, your breath shallow, as you wait for the inevitable ambush. You know it's coming, but you don't know when or where. Your mind races with possibilities, each worse than the last. A sudden snap of a branch makes you jump, but it's just a bird taking flight. For a moment you relax, only to hear another rustle, this time much closer. The enemy is near, but where are they? Are they already circling? Are they watching you right now? This is the kind of mental strain that the Australians had to endure day after day. The fear didn't just come from the threat of being killed. It came from the psychological game the Viet Cong played. They would often attack in the dead of night, striking without warning, only to disappear back into the jungle before the Australians could even react. This left the soldiers in a constant state of alertness. They learned to sleep with one eye open, never fully able to relax, always waiting for the next attack. The psychological toll was exacerbated by the heat, the humidity, and the constant exhaustion. The physical fatigue alone was enough to wear a soldier down, but when paired with the mental strain, it became almost unbearable. The Australians were used to tough conditions, but the jungles of Vietnam had a way of wearing down even the most hardened veterans. The oppressive heat, the swarming insects, the constant wetness from the sweat and rain, it all added up. But it wasn't just the environment that was the problem. It was the constant sense of dread. It felt like the jungle itself was closing in, like the enemy could be anywhere, watching from the shadows. But as much as the Viet Cong sought to break the Australians through fear, the Australians learned to turn the tables. They knew that the only way to overcome the fear was to face it head on. The key was discipline, trust, and camaraderie. The soldiers had learned to trust their training, and more importantly, to trust each other. In the face of fear, their unity was their greatest strength. For Private Allen, it was a lesson he would learn the hard way. During a particularly intense patrol, Allen's nerves got the best of him. He began to hear things that weren't there. Voices, whispers in the wind, footsteps that seemed to follow him everywhere. He began to panic, his mind racing with thoughts of the Viet Cong closing in from all sides. But it was Corporal Mitchell, the same soldier who had saved Jenkins during their first ambush, who pulled him back from the edge. "Calm down, Allen," Mitchell said softly. "They want you to be afraid. Don't give them that power. We've got your back." Mitchell's words hit Alan like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just about the enemy out there. It was about the enemy in his head. The fear had been winning, but now, with his comrades by his side, Alan could take control. The tension in his chest eased, and he breathed deeply, trying to clear his mind. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The soldiers had learned to manage fear by supporting each other. In a way, the psychological pressure of guerrilla warfare forged stronger bonds between them. They shared the same fear, the same exhaustion, and it was through that shared experience that they found their strength. Each man had a role to play, but it wasn't just about the tactics. It was about the mental resilience to push through when everything else was breaking down. The jungle was still a deadly place, but as the Australians learned to trust each other and face the psychological challenges head-on, they began to see the enemy differently. The Viet Cong's strength lay in their ability to manipulate the mind, to use fear as a weapon. But the Australians had discovered that by sticking together, they could resist the mental pressure. The jungle might have been their enemy, but it was also their ally. They learned how to use it, how to stay alert, how to read the signs of danger, and how to anticipate the enemy's next move. The psychological toll, however, wasn't something that could be turned off. The fear never truly left. It was always lurking just beneath the surface, ready to rise again the next time the jungle grew too quiet. But with every successful mission, with every ambush they survived, the soldiers became stronger, more confident. The jungle would never be tamed, but neither would they. They had learned to live with the fear, to embrace it, and to turn it into their own strength. As the patrol continued, the jungle once again became quiet. The sounds of distant gunfire echoed through the trees, a reminder that the war was never far away. The Australians had faced the psychological challenges of guerrilla warfare and come out the other side stronger. They had survived the mental toll, but they knew that each new mission would bring its own set of challenges, both physical and psychological. But with each other by their side, they were ready for whatever came next. Chapter 5. Victory through resilience. A legacy of guerrilla warfare. The war in Vietnam was not just a conflict of armies. It was a battle of endurance, of wits, and of resilience. For the Australian forces, their experience in the jungles of Vietnam became a defining chapter in military history. It wasn't about winning every battle or defeating every enemy. It was about survival, adapting, learning, and pushing forward when everything seemed stacked against them. In a war where the enemy often appeared as a shadow, it was the Australian soldiers' resilience that allowed them to outlast the Viet Cong and leave a lasting impact on the way guerrilla warfare would be fought for generations to come. The Australians had become experts in jungle warfare, not just through their training, but through necessity. The relentless heat, the oppressive humidity, and the constant threat of ambush had forged them into a unit unlike any other. Their tactics were refined, their patience honed. But it wasn't just their physical training that made them formidable. It was their mindset. Every soldier knew that survival was a matter of mental toughness as much as physical strength. They had to outlast their enemies, outthink them, and most of all, refuse to give in to fear. After every operation, the Australians would return to base, weary but determined. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat, their faces etched with exhaustion, but their spirits remained unbroken. Each mission was another test of their resolve. The Viet Cong had learned to fear them, not because the Australians were unbeatable in battle, but because they never gave up. The Australians had learned to live with fear, to adapt to the jungle, and to fight on, no matter the cost. The experience of guerrilla warfare in Vietnam left a lasting mark on the soldiers, shaping their understanding of what it meant to fight in unconventional warfare. They had learned to use the environment to their advantage, to set traps and to strike with precision. But more importantly, they had learned the value of resilience, the ability to endure, to keep moving forward even when the odds seemed insurmountable, was what set them apart from many other forces in the war. They didn't fight for glory. They fought to survive. The Australian forces' success in Vietnam wasn't measured by the number of victories they claimed, but by their ability to adapt and thrive in a war that was unlike anything they had ever experienced. The Viet Cong, with their knowledge of the jungle and their unorthodox tactics, had created a battlefield that was difficult for any force to navigate. But the Australians had found a way to fight back. They didn't rely on brute strength. They relied on cunning, discipline, and trust in one another. Their resilience didn't just come from their ability to survive in the jungle. It came from their ability to work together, to support each other, and to face the challenges of guerrilla warfare head on. The soldiers were a family, bound not just by their mission, but by their shared experiences and hardships. They learned to laugh together in the darkest moments, to offer a word of encouragement when one of them faltered, and to trust each other when everything else seemed uncertain. It was through this camaraderie that they found the strength to keep going, even when the weight of the war seemed unbearable. As the war in Vietnam came to a close, the legacy of the Australian forces' time in the jungle was felt far beyond the confines of the battlefield. Their tactics, their understanding of guerrilla warfare, and their ability to survive in one of the harshest environments in the world became a model for future military strategies. They had proved that in warfare, the true measure of success wasn't always victory in battle. It was the ability to adapt, to endure, and to come through the other side, stronger and wiser. In the years that followed, the Australian soldiers who had fought in Vietnam carried their experiences with them. They spoke less about the victories they had won and more about the lessons they had learned. They knew that they had fought not just for themselves, but for the future of warfare. The jungle had shaped them, but it had also prepared them for whatever would come next. Their time in Vietnam had shown them that resilience was the true key to survival. For the Australians, their time in the jungles of Vietnam wasn't just a chapter in military history. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. They had faced the enemy in the most unforgiving terrain, and they had come out on top, not because they were the strongest, but because they were the most resilient. Their story is one of survival, of adapting to the worst circumstances, and of never giving up, no matter how dire the situation seemed. In the end, the greatest victory of all was the one they carried with them. The knowledge that no matter what the future held, they had faced the worst and come through stronger as soldiers and as men.